Hello and welcome to yet another session of In Dialogue Foundation's Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2024 to 2025. I'm Zoya Ansari and I will be your moderator for today's session. Today we are delighted to have Dr. Ori Soltes with us. Dr. Soltes currently teaches theology, art history, philosophy, and political history at Georgetown University. He has extensive experience teaching across institutions such as the Johns Hopkins University, Cleveland State University, and others. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Soltes has lectured at numerous prestigious museums, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Gallery of Art, and the Smithsonian Institution, among others. His deep knowledge has been featured on CNN, the History Channel, and the Discovery Channel. Dr. Soltes has even hosted a popular series on ancient civilization for middle school students. Dr. Soltes will be speaking today on the topic Faith-Based Humanism of Mahatma Gandhi and Fethullah Gulen. We are thrilled to have him today with us. Sir, you have about 2 hours for the session and you may leave as much time for the questions and discussion as you prefer. And thank you so much, Dr. Soltes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zoya. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be involved in any way with an organization such as In Dialogue, the very name of which I love. So I thought what I would do is a kind of brief rundown, kind of comparative rundown of Gandhi and Gulen in terms of briefly their biographies and also, of course, what both of them end up teaching and standing for. Gandhi, of course, was born in 1869. He perished by an assassin's bullets in 1948. Gulen would at that point have been 10 years old. He was born in 1938. The interesting thing is that in many sources, you find Gulen's birth date as 1941, including if you Google him up on the internet, because his parents did not register his birth for several years because having given him the name of Fethullah, which has the word Allah or God in it, during a period when under Ataturk and his successors, Turkey was so determined to be a secular state, it was not acceptable to name your child with such a name. So in fact, they could not register him in 1938. And it took several years until a sympathetic clerk allowed the registration to happen. So his birth date is often given as 1941, although indeed it was 1938. And he was born to, of course, a Turkish family, a Sunni Muslim family, and that's an oversimplification, but I'll just leave it at that. His father was an imam, and his mother was a teacher, and a teacher in particular of the Quran, and both of them came from very distinguished, pious Muslim backgrounds going back many generations. His grandparents, like his parents, very pious, and I mean that not just in the vague general sense, but in the formal sense of how frequently one prays, formally 5 times a day, but with a whole group of prayers beyond the prescribed prayers that one offers 5 times a day. So that in addition to salat, you have what's called dua and fasts. And his mother also was an enormously hospitable individual. She always felt it was a bad day if somehow in the course of that day, no guests had come by for a meal. So this is the background from which he came. And he himself, as a small child, Gulen, was drawn to a kind of pious life. He has and had, because many of them are now deceased. He is in his 80s, obviously. Siblings who didn't go quite in the direction that he went in. So it was him and not just his background that drove him in that direction. He was very interested in Islam, in the Quran and Hadith, in the lives of the Muslim saints, even as a child, and apparently was criticized heavily by one of his elementary school teachers, because again, the environment was one where one was expected to be secularized. And so his kind of behavior was found offensive. Gandhi's parents, of course, were Hindu. He grew up in a Gujarati Hindu Modh-Banya family. So as with Islam, so with Hinduism, it's not that it's a misnomer, but it's an oversimplification to refer to someone simply as a Muslim or to refer to someone simply as a Hindu. And you could say the same of Christianity, Judaism, because there's so many different modes of expressing what might be characterized by that kind of overall term. We call his father a Hindu. We speak of his mother as coming from a Hindu family, but a Brahmani Vaishnava Hindu family. So that already says specific things about her. The Brahmani group of which she is part saw as primary text, or sees as primary text, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavad Puranas, and a whole series of a dozen, really 14 other texts that they assert offer a kind of the essence of the Vedas, but also the Quran and the Bible. So it is a unique kind of subset of what we might call Hinduism. And she was, like Gulen's mother, extremely, extremely pious. She'd never begin a meal without prayers. She thought nothing of fasts, and one fast following another fast was nothing to her. So he grew up in an environment that actually was somewhat similar to that in which Gulen grew up, the key difference being that Gulen grew up in such a pious environment in a Turkey that was proclaiming itself not just secular and not just that the church should be separate from the state, but that made it increasingly difficult to be a Muslim in what was trying to become a secular state. I believe that Ataturk, who is the George Washington, to use an American kind of metaphor, the George Washington of Turkey, the creator of the modern Turkish state, made two primary errors in the state that he was shaping. And Turkey is still, I would say, suffering from aspects of or outcomes of those two features. One was in his determination to make it secular, he essentially fought a war against religious expression. It was impossible in public for a woman, for example, a pious Muslim woman, to wear a scarf because that was considered offensive to the idea of a secular state. And as I already indicated, in the case of Gulen himself, his birth and being named Fethullah was considered an offense to the state. So that was one issue. And as a second very important issue, whereas Ataturk had initially been part of a group back in 1908 called the Young Turks, in which the political party that supported them, that they supported, involved Turks and Kurds and Jews and Armenians and Greeks and so on and so forth. Very quickly, that party of which he was part became Turanian, that is, Turkish nationalist. And by the time he had begun to forge the new state in the 20s, he was firmly entrenched in a Turkish nationalist sense of how to be in the world. And as a consequence, the most obvious example of a non-Turkish group within Turkey that was denied and continues to a large extent to be denied its identity are the Kurds. So in fact, under Ataturk, the Kurds, most of whom lived in eastern Turkey, were referred to as Mountain Turks. They were not even referred to as Kurds. And they were forbidden from teaching in their schools the Kurdish languages, Kurdish culture, and so on and so forth. So both Gulen and Gandhi grew up in very pious families, one Muslim, one Hindu, but in different environments with respect to the capacity for expressing oneself religiously. Gandhi, I remind you, is 2 generations earlier than Gulen, so it's also a different time in the world in general. And the time when Gandhi was being born in India, Turkey was in the last throes of its Ottoman phase. In fact, Abdul Hamid II would have been the last major Sultan of Turkey. That's the period in which Gandhi was growing up in India when that was happening in Turkey. I hope I've confused you a little bit so far. I'll try and confuse you further. In any case, Gandhi was, following tradition within his community, married by way of an arranged marriage at the age of 13 to his wife Kasturba, popularly known as Ba, and of course I've not given you the whole long name, but Kasturba will suffice for our purposes. She was a bit older than he. She was an old woman. She was 14. And one of the interesting things about which Gandhi later writes is his passion for her. And he writes later on, embarrassed at how he couldn't get her out of his head. You know, he's in school and he's thinking about his wife. Initially, she lived probably more with her family than with him. But eventually, by the time he was 15 and she was 16, they had their first child, a son, who, alas, died after a few days. But eventually, they had 4 sons over the course of the years that followed. By contrast, Gulen never got married. And his family also, by tradition, was hoping to arrange a marriage for him. And his mother, aware of his piety, was very careful about whom she was looking for to be a wife for Gulen, someone who would be pious and so on. He was, as you might imagine, someone of his ilk would have been extremely obedient to his parents. He loved his parents, and what his parents wanted, he always wanted to do. The one area in which he failed to do what they wanted him to do was to get married. And the reason for that was that as Gulen grew into his 20s, so the arranged marriage would have been then, it wouldn't have been as early as it was in Gandhi's case. He began to feel this calling to do what he would end up doing, which we, of course, will talk about, and felt that he would not be a good husband or a good father because he'd be too focused on his work and too focused on the work of working for others. The Turkish word for service, and I'll come back to it several times, is hizmet. And so that became the kind of goal of his life, to be involved in serving others. And he felt that as such, he would not be a good husband and would not be a good father. So several times his mother said, how about this young woman? How about that young woman? He kept saying, no, no. And he was already about 30, 31 when his mother said to him, look, this is your last chance. After this, no more attempts. And he said, no, Mom, I can't. So very different in that regard. And in fact, Gandhi surely was torn early on between what he wanted to do with his life as a career and how he could balance that with his life as a father and as a husband. Because when he found after a while that he was making no headway in trying to get a decent education in law, which was the direction he wanted to go in Mumbai, what was then, of course, called Bombay, it was suggested to him by an uncle, by an older brother who was also already a lawyer, that he go to London, that he would have many more opportunities there. So he went to London and studied law for 3 years. Needless to say, he left his wife and newborn child, their first child, at home in Mumbai during that period. And it was there in London that we see the beginnings of the Gandhi about whom we hear and read. He developed an interest in the poor dockland communities, the impoverished dockland communities in London, and began to be interested in organizing on their behalf. There was a strike that was held by the dock workers, and they were supported by other members of the lower economic class community who were not dock workers. And ultimately, it was a success. And so it was his first, not only expression of support and interest in an impoverished class, but also his first acquaintance with the methodology of how one improves one's situation by a strike which was, by definition, as it was there, nonviolent. It was really about not working. It was about not cooperating. If we dock workers aren't operating, then the docks don't operate. And all you mucky mucks with all the money made by the substances that we transfer from ship to shore and shore to ship can't make your money. So unless you're going to give in to our demand, which is to have a livable salary, then you'll go nowhere. So it was a success. And if again I look by comparison to Fethullah Gulen, whereas Gandhi saw very clearly that the path forward to what he was growing into a sense of wanting to accomplish went through an education that culminated with a law degree, Gulen was in almost the opposite in a sense. He stopped going to school by late elementary school. So he had a very limited formal education. Most of his education in his early teens and a bit beyond was self-education, and also tutored by his own mother, who was, and his own father, who were experts in Islamic culture, history, literature. And so that's the direction he took. And he apparently had, has, a prodigious memory. So by the age of 10 or 11, he became what's called a hafiz. A hafiz, as most of you are probably aware, is someone who has memorized the entirety of the Quran. But he not only memorized the Quran, he was conversant and scholarly in the Hadith, which is the secondary body of literature in Islam, that if I can make this kind of nutshell comparison, the Quran is the word of God transmitted through the Prophet Muhammad. The Hadith are words about the Prophet Muhammad, or words of the Prophet Muhammad in his own voice, rather than that speaking as a conduit through which God speaks. And the Hadith becomes an essential part of fundamental, foundational Muslim literature, because often it will draw out threads that are mere threads in the Quran and weave them into a tapestry. I'll give you a very basic, banal, fundamental example. The Quran mentions prayer in 3 different places. It talks about prayer times, but without any specificity. And in one place, it mentions 3 times. In 2 other places, it mentions 2 different times. It's in the Hadith that we have a kind of articulated layout of 5 prayer times. And that idea, therefore, comes indirectly out of the Quran, but directly out of the Hadith. And many of the important aspects of Islam, such as not only prayer, but prayer as one of 5 different important elements, pillars of Islam, belief being the first, prayer being the second, the third being a formalized kind of charity called zakat, which is in addition to and apart from the informal kind of charity called sadaqah, the importance of fast and the custom of fasting that originates as the first 10 days of the month of, or rather the 10th day of the month of Ramadan, evolves to become the first 10 days, and then the entire month of Ramadan, again, is evolved by way of hadith and not specifically found within the Quran. And the 5th pillar, of course, is Hajj, is pilgrimage. So these ideas develop in hadith, and then beyond hadith, of course, you have schools of interpretation. The word in Arabic is madhab. So different schools, Hanbali, Hanafi, for example, to just mention 2 within the realm of Sunni Islam. There are other schools within the realm of Shi'i Islam, and so on and so forth. My point being that in all of this, Gulen in his teens became enormously conversant, as well as literature that discussed and described the lives of the various prophets, for there are many in Islam. Muhammad is the seal, the culmination of the cadre of messengers that begin in a certain sense with Adam, but in another sense with Ibrahim, with Abraham, and then continue through most of the figures whom one finds in the Jewish and Christian traditions who are treated and understood to be prophets are similarly understood by Islam. And that all leads to Muhammad within Islam. And so Gulen was extremely conversant in all of that. The interesting thing is that in the end, he does go to get certified by the state in 1958 to become an imam. So whereas Gandhi becomes a lawyer, Gulen becomes an imam. And it is interesting the way their respective careers as such will parallel each other in very particular sorts of ways. So Gandhi becomes a lawyer. He goes back to India after these 3 years in England, and he really doesn't find particular success there. And probably the key reason is that they're looking for litigating types. And to be a litigator, one of the things you've got to be able to do is to cross-examine your witnesses. And he's very uncomfortable doing that. Gandhi was very uncomfortable through most of his early life speaking up at all. He was very shy. He was very unassuming. And he actually takes a course in public speaking to help him become more comfortable while he's in London, to help him become more comfortable speaking. But at the same time, that's not what he appeals. That's not what appeals to him. He doesn't mind doing contracts and things of that sort, but that's not really what's going to lead to a law career. And then, interestingly, in 1893, he is offered a job as a lawyer by a Muslim whose firm in South Africa needs legal services. So in 1893, he goes to South Africa, figuring he'll spend a year organizing this firm in terms of its legal needs, and then he'll come back to India. And in the end, he ends up staying in South Africa for 21 years because he becomes increasingly interested in and involved in and concerned about how Indians, like himself, are treated by the white South Africans. South Africa at that point being primarily under British and Dutch control, and that will play out until the Boer Wars. But he himself experiences a lot of not just prejudice. I mean, he's paid for a first-class ticket in the first-class car of the train, and the white conductor throws him off the train. How dare you? You're a person of color. What are you doing? And this is reserved for white people. And he ends up spending the night in the train station, rather chilled, but decides the next day to protest. And interestingly, he wins his protest. So the next day he's put back on the train. But those kinds of experiences, and this is relatively benign. He's beaten by a policeman because he's walking on the sidewalk. People of color are not allowed on the sidewalk. And I should say that the vocabulary in English in South Africa distinguishes whites from coloreds, and coloreds means Indians, and blacks, and that means Africans. So there are three striations of color as far as the racial prejudices and terminology of South Africa are concerned. And he briefly, during those 21 years, in fact, goes back in 1902 to India to mobilize support for Indians in South Africa, because India is obviously the most important of the British colonies. And if you can generate support of the right sort within India that will push back against the British there because of what's happening in South Africa against the Indians, that will be a much more effective instrument, he figures, than just the relatively smaller Indian population in South Africa itself. So his 21 years are years of preoccupation and, in the most positive sense of this term, obsession with the anti-color prejudices that he encounters for the first time so extremely in South Africa. And it causes him more broadly to begin to question the standing of Indians within the British Empire at all. When he comes back from London, and when he first comes to South Africa, he thinks of himself as a Brit first and an Indian second. Because in the 3 years he was there, he was intensely desperate to become like the Brits, among whom, of course, he was living and moving. Interestingly, when he was determined to go there, his mother was very, very concerned that he would be swallowed up by all the worst things that the West has had to offer, and still, of course, has to offer, in terms of its gastronomy, in terms of its cultural customs, in terms of things like smoking, things like drinking, bars, all that sort of stuff. And he swore a vow to her that he would not take up any of that stuff, which he lived up to. And in fact, it's in London that he became a vegetarian because he found that he couldn't deal with the gastronomic alternatives unless he withdrew altogether from the consumption of any and all kinds of meat. And it wasn't just a matter of not eating pork or not eating beef or not eating either. It was broader than that. And by the way, his wife gave him his blessing to go to London. I should add that. Whereas his mother was very concerned, his wife gave him his blessing. And I should also mention that he lived within the small community of Indians from within his own community in India, but the elders of that community in India essentially threw him out of the community when he determined to go to London because they were convinced, in spite of his vow, that he was simply going to betray all of their values and just become a Brit. So it's a kind of interesting paradox. He in no way became a Brit as far as his private life and his personal life was concerned, but in his public life, he was determined to be one and thought of himself as one, more so than as an Indian when he came back to India and when he went off to South Africa. But as he began to experience all of these prejudices expressed in more and less benign ways, he began to rethink the whole issue of India priding itself on being a British colony, but that rather it should be rethinking that and pushing back against the Brits and thinking towards independence. So from 1893, for the next 21 years, until the outbreak that would be of World War I, 1914, he's almost entirely in South Africa. He's functioning as a lawyer, and more what he's engaged in is a growing campaign to change the system, essentially. I don't think he has as an ambition for South Africa that its European masters be removed, but what he wants to do is change them so that conditions change for the Indian minority that is there. And eventually, of course, that will broaden, but not initially. I'll get to that in a few moments. Eventually, to include the black Africans that, of course, are the ultimate underclass in South Africa at that time, and of course, for many, many years thereafter. If again, by contrast, I look at Fethullah Gulen when he is stepping into the professional life that he will assume as an imam. So he is certified by the state as an imam in 1958. Again, think paradox. Turkey, the secular state, is not likely, with a population that is 99% Muslim, to simply efface Islam from its personality, but its ambition under Ataturk and his successors is, in a sense, to limit and control Islam. So there are mosques, they're not being closed down, and there are imams, they're not being put out of jobs, but you have to be certified by the state, so the state knows that you're going to preach and teach in a certain manner that won't go contrary to the interests and the desires of the state as a secular state, and that will confine Islam to an appropriately private corner of the life of its population. And so what the imamship of Gulen, which essentially begins in Izmir on the center of the West Coast, begins with mosques that are very underpopulated. And he recognizes that the khutbahs, the sermons that he delivers on Friday at the noon prayers, has as an audience, a handful of old people. And that's not where the future for the Islam that he so loves, as someone who has grown up, not only because of his family, but because of whatever it is in his own personality that makes him this way, that he's grown up so pious and so in love with Islam, that the future is not to be found in the mosques where he is preaching to a handful of old people. He realizes he's got to get to the young people. And the way to do that is to go out of the mosque and go into the coffee shops, because that's where they're hanging out. So if I can make the distinction in Turkified language between a khutbah and a sohbet, where a khutbah is the kind of sermon that you would give on Friday, a sohbet is a kind of conversation, a dialogue, a discussion that you have with a group about some subject. he goes out into the coffee shops where he is engaging young people in conversations. And of course, not surprisingly, as secularized as they are, they have an interest in Islam. They have an interest in their backgrounds from this weirdo imam who has come out of the mosque and to be with them, and who furthermore can talk their language and not just the language of a kind of traditional elder piety. And their questions are not limited to Islam. They extend to, well, literature and science and politics in the contemporary world. So one of the things that Gulen needs to continue doing is his self-education. That's what he'd always did. And again, he's gifted with a mind that, first of all, has an extraordinary memory. And so he is able also to read Plato and to read Einstein and to read Said Nursi, an important Muslim thinker who was about a generation older than he, and to read Rumi, the delightful 13th century Sufi poet, who is claimed by the Azeris and claimed by the Persians and claimed by the Turks alike for reasons beyond this discussion, because of where he wandered, where he was born, grew up, where he went, where he wrote, and so on. He develops an extraordinary range of bodies of knowledge that he is able to share. And I suspect, because he was a very effective pedagogue, that there were things that he didn't know. But when a kid would say, well, what about such and such? I suspect that what he would say is, I'm not sure. Come back tomorrow and I'll have an answer for you. So he was both continually broadening his repertoire and deepening his repertoire, and at the same time, of course, drawing students, people in, more and more of these young people with their questions, to become interested and involved in what he had to say. And people started recording his stuff. And then these tapes were multiplied. And gradually, he was being well known across Turkey for these sohbets as much as for his khutbahs, as much for what he had to say about the contemporary world as for what he had to say about the Prophet Muhammad and the relationship between him and Abu Bakr and Ali and the other Rashidun, the other right-minded original four caliphs. And so what could almost be construed as a kind of movement developed with him at its head. One of the things that he felt strongly about was the Turkish youth was very much lost and afloat. We're talking about the 60s, and that what they needed to reground them and to re-expand them in a positive way was a reconnection to their Muslim roots. And it was the disconnection from Islam that had left them afloat. And if you think of the world at large in the 60s, that can be said across America, Europe, Turkey, other parts of the world, where there was a kind of crisis for the youth of trying to figure out where we fit into the world and how the world can be made a better place. So his initial interest was in providing, in this informal but effective manner, the beginnings of Islamic education for Turkish Muslim youth. And his idea began to broaden. He realized, well, what about all those kids, out there in the eastern provinces who don't have access to the kind of educational possibilities that I am starting to formulate here? So he began to develop a system not only of schools, but also of dormitories where kids without the funds could come from the countryside into the big city, where how the heck can they do that? How can they afford to stay there, if they can even get there, that provided living accommodations for free, that provided food, and also in each of these dormitories would provide one inhabitant who was an older student, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 years or more older than the students incoming, who could function as a kind of older brother, an abi. for the incoming students. So the network is expanding, and it functions on a range, so to say, of different levels. And of course, where do you come up with the funds to provide what I've just described? Because Gulen himself is not only a poor imam, but unlike most imams, he would insist on paying a certain percentage of his salary back as rent to the mosque, because after all, he's using its electricity, he's using its water. There was a period of 2 years where instead of having some accommodation provided by the mosque, he actually would live in one of those, he would sleep in one of those, large window areas where you could lay down a blanket and there's space to sleep. But he was very different. But in addition to his memory, and I should add a second thing about his intellect, because it's one thing to memorize. It's another thing to think about the words that you've memorized. And it turns out that Gulen was not only gifted with the memory, but with that kind of an analytic ability. And so when he is teaching, he's not just saying, all right, what does it say in the 5th surah, the 3rd ayat, of the Quran? That's not his interest. His interest is, what does that ayat, what does that verse mean? And I'm aware of classes more recently than what I'm describing right now, toward the beginning of his career, that he has held, where over a 3-month period, they're talking about 3 verses from the Quran, because he is constantly revisiting what the meanings, plural, can be. And as such, by the way, we understand someone who understands very clearly that religion is not about revelation. Religion is about revelation and interpretation, because the same revelation, the Torah, in which all traditional Jews agree, or the same revelation, the Gospels, in which all Christians agree, or the same revelation, the Quran, in which all Muslims agree, or the Gita, in which all Krishnite Hindus agree, is then open to an almost endless array of interpretive understandings. What does it mean not to commit murder? What does it mean to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? What does it mean that it's more important that what comes out of your mouth than what goes into your mouth? What does it mean to take on your cousins, Arjuna, as those who are upsetting the dharma of things, and because you as a kshatriya have as an obligation to be doing just that? Is it simply a matter of war? Or is there something else that is going on in the Gita that has something to do with the war that I'm fighting inside myself spiritually, more than it has to do with the physical war of taking up my bow and arrows against my enemies? So Gulen, in his educational processes, is engaged constantly in thinking about the text that he already was teaching, directly and indirectly, in the coffee shops of Izmir back in the early or mid 1960s. But to come back to the question that I asked rhetorically before interrupting myself, how is he providing for this? Where do the funds come from? And the answer is, another characteristic of Fethullah Gulen clearly was his enormous charisma, because he managed to encourage and induce middle class or upper middle class secular Muslims, but who became infatuated with what it was that he was offering to their kids and to other kids and to kids in general, to help them out. And sometimes the helping out was simple and straightforward. He goes into the home of a patron of his who has 2 bedrooms, obviously very well furnished. And he asks him about the 2nd bedroom. Well, that bedroom's for my wife and me. That bedroom is for my son. But where's your son? Well, he's gone from home. He got his education. He's off working. He said, then you don't need all the furnishings. I want them for the dormitory. Oh, okay. So he would gain that kind of support. And of course, individuals like that would also gradually make straight out contributions to help finance the purchase of the building in which this dormitory is going to be housed, and so on and so forth. So he's building a system that is centered on the issue of education, with a growing cadre of those who assist him, because they are so taken with what it is that he has to offer. coming back to Gandhi. So Gandhi, we left in 1893 when he went to South Africa. And I said he intended to spend a year there, and instead, with the exception of the brief period in 1902 when he went to India to gain support for what he was developing there, he ended up spending 21 years there because he was developing something. So a year after moving there, he had already began to associate with what he co-organized as the Natal Indian Congress. Natal was the name of the primary colony in which Indians settled in South Africa that then became a province. And so it was the Natal Indian Congress, and it became the instrument through which that population could express and voice its needs and its opposition to how it was being treated by and large by the governing British white leadership. In 1900, in the midst of that Boer War, Gandhi decided to organize a volunteer group called the Natal Indian Ambulance Corps. So they weren't going to take up weapons, nor probably would they have been permitted to take up weapons by the Brits. But here's the thing. This ambulance corps is designed to remove wounded soldiers from the battlefront, which is to say, it requires people who are not afraid to be moving into the middle of the battle, into the battlefront in order to do what they're doing. And his point and his purpose was to push back against the prejudice that Indians are just too meek and they're just too weak and they can't do any manly kinds of tasks. The view of the Brits were the Muslims can do that. They have a war history, but the Indians, AKA Hindus, can't. And he wanted to, of course, demonstrate that this was not true. So he organized a corps of 1,100 volunteers who were in the thick of the battle, not fighting, but removing the wounded, obviously, with the bullets flying. And at the end of the Boer War, 38, including Gandhi himself, received the Queen's South Africa Medal. And it began to transform the British understanding of Indians. That didn't mean that it solved the problem, but it's the beginning of a process which is obviously going to take another half century to work itself out altogether. And it began a change for the Brits. It also began a change for Gandhi. He began to broaden his own focus, to expand it on racism more broadly, not just against Indians, but he began to become focused on and interested in and aware of how intensely the Africans were the recipients of racist attitudes and policies on the part of the white rulership. And we see this in a very obvious way in Gandhi, the newspaper that he created called Indian Opinion, that by 1910, there was considerable coverage of discrimination against Africans and what was happening to them. And eventually, in that same year, he also establishes a kind of collective farm that he names after the renowned Russian writer and advocate of peace, Tolstoy. He calls it the Tolstoy Farm, in which he is developing his ideas, most importantly, the idea of peaceful resistance. So Gandhi, in the course of those 21 years in South Africa, moves from a perspective that assumes a kind of British identity that he comes to recognize by definition means an identity that would look down upon his fellow Indians and himself. And beyond his pushing back against that, a broadening of his perspective to push back against the idea of racism at all, against any and all groups, against any and all minorities, or actually in the case of South Africa, majorities. In an analogous manner, Gulen, as he began to develop a movement that is popularly referred to, even by some today, and again, if you Google Gulen on the internet, this will come up, the Gulen movement. an idea that he enormously opposed, because by calling it the Gulen movement, it sounds very much like the cult that Gulen's detractors would like to pretend it is. In fact, the more appropriate term, and it's more commonly used now, is Hizmet movement. And I already mentioned to you once before that term Hizmet, which means service. And Gulen's perspective by the late 70s, at least, was that the issue is not an issue of Turkish Muslim youth. It's much broader than that. It's an issue, first of all, that it pertains to the youth across the Muslim world. So the kind of schools that he began to shape with a curriculum, I might point out, paradoxically, which ends up covering everything from the fine arts to literature to language to science to sports. The one area in the schools that he and his followers began to found did not teach was religion. Of course, in secular Turkey, it would be illegal to be teaching religion. And gradually, that idea appealed to Gulen more and more, because as much as his starting point was Islam, as he began to expand his focus and his schools began to expand over the Turkish borders into other Turkic countries like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and the like, he began to realize, it's not about Muslims. It's not only not about Turks, it's not about Muslims, it's about people. It's about all groups. We all have to be working together if we are to solve the problems of the world. And he looked at the problems of the world at that time as really being threefold. Ignorance. And so the whole point and purpose of these schools was to provide an antidote to the problem of ignorance. And there are now Hizmet schools in about 170 countries all over the world. And they share in common the kind of curricula that I just noted, offering everything but instruction in religion. And they share in common a connection to a second aspect of problematicism, as Gulen was starting to see things, not just ignorance, which is solved by education, but poverty, which is solved by programs that help alleviate poverty. And as an example of where those two intersect in a particularly delightful manner, I visited a school in Sydney, Australia, a high school, or what we Americans would call a high school. And the upper two classes, the 11th and 12th graders in that school in Sydney, were tasked with creating a garden of organic vegetables because there was space in the school yard to do that, because it's very hard to get organic vegetables in that area of Sydney. So they would grow the vegetables, and a consequence of that is, of course, they become aware of what farmers have to endure in order to produce the products that they produce. They have to worry about the rain, and they have to worry about the wind and the sun, and they have to worry about insects and all those different elements that can affect the success or failure of the crop you're trying to produce. And then the produce that they successfully did produce, they kind of went door to door and they sold it in the neighborhood to neighbors who were thrilled to be able to get organic vegetables. And then the funds that were the outcome of the sales, they sent to a community that had identified in West Africa where they had no easy access to water, so that the members of the community, and it was primarily the women, would have to go over a mile to the river, the nearest water source, to bring back water, in jugs on their heads. They provided the funds. The school kids provided the funds so that community could dig a well and develop a piping system so they could have fresh water, which would affect, obviously, everything from, what you get to drink to how you get to clean yourself. So they're performing a kind of social service that connects to the alleviation of a condition of poverty within the context of the kind of education that they're all getting. And the third element, indeed, is the element of strife. And so with that in mind, Gulen came to understand that we need to organize the kinds of programs that bring people together of different ethnicities, of different nationalities, of different races, of different genders, of different religions, so that we can come together and come to know one another and work together to improve the world, rather than find ourselves confined by sectarian prejudices that lead to strife and, more often than not, to violence. I would say that there would be a fourth feature that more recently would be front and center for the Hizmet movement. That's the whole problem of climate change and the threat, again, to all of humanity that problem sort of offers. So the Hizmet movement, as he was shaping it beyond the 70s into the 80s, 90s, and emphatically over the last 25 years or so, is a movement designed to serve humanity. And it's a movement, an underlying principle of which is altruism. That's a theme that Gulen in his preachings and teachings, his writings and his speaking repeats again and again. It's about doing what needs to be done because it needs to be done, not because you expect a personal payback. His own perspective is, as someone who is a pious Muslim and who is in particular drawn to the kind of teachings that one can extract from a Sufi poet like Rumi, who writes, as a dyed-in-the-wool Muslim, phrases like, I go into the mosque, I go into the church, I go into the synagogue, I see one altar. So who's simultaneously a dyed-in-the-wool Muslim and a universalist in the 13th century, in the period when the Crusades are still going on, in the period of the Mongol invasions, when within the Muslim world, within the Christian world, and between the Christian and Muslim worlds, there's so much strife. Rumi is advocating a kind of universalist sensibility, even as it doesn't make him one whit less a pious Muslim. And Gulen is cut from a similar kind of cloth. And among the inspirations for his thinking, I would include high on the list someone like Rumi. So his perspective about why I have to work to improve the world for all of humanity and why I have to work to improve the world is because God, Allah, made all of humanity and God loves all of humanity. God loves the world that God made. So if I claim to be someone who loves God, and that's the point and purpose of his personal piety, his intense prayers 5 times a day plus, and so on, then I have to love all of humanity and not just a discrete group, Turkish, Sunni Muslims of a particular subset sort. So both he and Gandhi, in different ways, move from a more narrow perspective to a broader perspective over the course of their developing careers. And of course, where Gandhi is concerned, by the early part of World War I, by 1915, he is already starting to become engaged in the struggle for Indian independence, which will take another 32 years to work out until 1947. He joins the Indian National Congress. He, in fact, led it beginning in 1920 for many years. And by 1930, he declares Indian independence unilaterally. He doesn't check with the British. He just simply says, we will be independent from this point forward. And of course, how can you become independent? How can you be independent if you still have your political overlords and your socioeconomic overlords still very much present across India? And the answer that he arrives at is a policy of non-cooperation. It goes all the way back, I think, to what he first saw when he was first in London with the dock workers and that strike, that if we refuse to cooperate in all the realms in which we operate, which is all the realms, all the services that we provide to the Brits, if we're not offering them, they can't function. They will come around to us. And of course, the initial response of the British is simply to arrest him. He's arrested for the first of many times in 1922. He is able to to leave, to get out of prison the next year because he has an appendicitis, and so they allow him to go to the hospital. But one of the interesting features of how this is developing from early on with Gandhi is if he advocates non-cooperation vis-a-vis the Brits, he eventually coins the turn of phrase satyagraha, civil disobedience. Satya, as I'll repeat later on, is a Sanskrit word for truth. And so graha, it might be translated as an appeal to. So satyagraha is an appeal to truth. So the idea is that if I appeal to truth, if I try and invoke in you an understanding of that, I can gain from you what I need without being violent about it. So it comes to be treated as, or the English phrase that comes to be used to translate satyagraha is civil disobedience. It's not an accurate translation. It's really a translation of the concept. And eventually, the most stunning and extraordinary moment within all of this is the march that he conducts against the salt tax, the famous salt satyagraha moment, in which, interestingly, the British have in their employee Indians who are armed with these bamboo sticks that have steel within them. And they are beating the heck out of the nonviolent protesters who, according to eyewitnesses, I wasn't there, I'm not quite old enough, I was not there, didn't even often raise their hands to sort of ward off blows. So they simply took the blows, skulls cracked, shoulders broken and dislocated, and so on. That would ultimately, of course, have an enormous influence because of the media on the world and its view of the Brits and their view of themselves, and the Brits and the view of how they wanted to be viewed by the world and by themselves, and would be a very important moment within this long struggle to gain Indian independence. So non-cooperation was a starting point. Satyagraha was a further development. And on the other hand, the Khalifate movement that emerged from 1918 is a movement of Hindu-Muslim cooperation. His idea was that Hindus and Muslims, because the Muslims represent an enormous minority within the Hindu majority in India, then as now, should work together to shape an India that would be free of its colonial masters. And interestingly, that started to break apart 4 or 5, 6 years later, when after 1922-23, Ataturk, the same Ataturk whom I earlier mentioned, in founding the state of the modern state of Turkey, as I mentioned, was very Turcocentric, but also Islamocentric. His followers were, in spite of his desire for Turkey to be non-Muslim and secular, or to be secular Muslim. So many Muslims left the Indian National Congress to found their own organizations at that point forward. And that, of course, will become a complex issue in and of itself as time moves on. By comparison, and similarly and in contrast, the Hizmet movement that Fethullah Gulen was developing was altogether non-political. He is, after all, not trying to gain a political end, an independent political status for Muslims in Turkey, in the Muslim Turkish world in which he grows up. He is rather trying to bring Turkey back to a sense of its Muslim identity, and then steps beyond that to be concerned for the larger picture of human identity and the need to solve the problems that humans across the planet have of ignorance and poverty and strife through interfaith and inter-ethnic and international kind of work. But his idea of Islam at its best is that it's not political at all. It's civil. And so the kind of Islam that Gulen is promoting is civil Islam. And that puts him obviously on the exact opposite side of the fence from Muslim groups and leaders like the Taliban, like ISIS, like the Ayatollah Khomeini and the current Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. his perspective is that within the political realm, Islam is best served by being part of a democratic government rather than part of a theocratic or autocratic kind of government. And whereas initially he was on any number of occasions between the late 70s and the late 90s, the object of personal persecution on the part of whichever Turkish government happened to be in place at the time, who found him because of his vast following and because of his advocacy for learning about Islam threatening, so that Gulen would ultimately find himself caught between two kinds of Turkish groups who opposed him, and that remains true, I would say, today. The secular Turks, who feared of him that he was going to try, that he wanted to turn Turkey into Iran, that he wanted to turn it into an Islamist, if I can use that term as opposed to Islamic, an Islamist state. And on the other hand, the pious and traditional and conservative Muslims in Turkey who were aghast at the fact that not only was he interested in and willing to speak with diverse kinds of Muslims, so both Sunni and Shi'i, those of this madhab and those of that madhab, but interested in conversation and dialogue and working together with non-Muslims, with Jews, with Christians, with Hindus, with Baha'is, with Sikhs, with Jains, and so on and so forth. The culmination of all of this is that in the mid to late 90s, interestingly, he and Recep Erdogan are both facing a kind of persecution by the federal government at that point. And by 1999, Gulen actually leaves Turkey because he has a heart condition. And his physicians say, look, you've got to go to America. You can get better heart care. And also, you cannot be in the midst of all this surging violence and anguish and anger, because it's just not good for your heart, right? At that point, he would have been 60, 61 years old. So he moved to Saylorsburg, which is in eastern Pennsylvania here in the United States. And the interesting thing is that when Erdogan, who was the successful mayor of Istanbul, made a bid to become prime minister and created this, what was called the Freedom and Justice Party, the AKP, somewhat to the right of center, but seemed to Gulen to offer some of the same sorts of issues and ideas that Gulen himself felt would most benefit Turkey, to wit, a strong support for its democratic constitution and its democratic infrastructure, but also an opening up of Turkey to an acceptance of its Muslim roots. Gulen supported Erdogan. He's often said to have been friends with him. He was not friends with him. He supported him because he thought that Erdogan offered what Turkey needed for Turkey to move forward. And he did help him in very concrete ways. I mean, he had by then a very large following, and he encouraged his followers to support Erdogan, but also in more less obvious ways. Gulen himself told me this story when I asked him, why does Erdogan have it in for you so strongly? And he said, well, I think it's because back when we were still in close contact, he was heading to a meeting with individuals who, through my network, I knew were setting him up for a huge political embarrassment. And so I called him. I said, you shouldn't go to that meeting because it won't be good for you. And I would never, he wouldn't even tell me, I would never, ever say what that was about. But Erdogan is afraid that I'll at some point reveal what that situation was, and it will be embarrassing to him at that point. And my comment to Gulen was, well, Mr. Erdogan cannot imagine someone like you who wouldn't take advantage of a situation and use it against him, because with the shoe on the other foot, he wouldn't hesitate to use anything at his disposal against you or against some political enemy. So naturally, he assumes that's what she would do. I believe, by the way, that the reason is a more fundamental one, which is that as Erdogan evolved his political profile as prime minister moving forward, he presented himself as a pious Muslim in a very public and ultimately false manner. And Gulen is a genuinely pious Muslim whose piety is personal and private. He does not pray in public to show how pious he is. This is something Erdogan will do. So I always feel of Erdogan and Gulen that if you are familiar with the fairy tale of Snow White and the wicked stepmother, show of hands, how many are familiar with the fairy tale of Snow White? All right. Well, for those of you who are not, it begins with the wicked stepmother who has a mirror, and on the wall, that sits on the wall, and every morning she asks the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And the mirror always says, "You, my queen." But then Snow White is born. Snow White grows up. Snow White is this both, emotionally, mentally, psychologically, spiritually, and physically absolutely beautiful. And one morning, the wicked stepmother, Snow White's stepmother, the queen, asks the mirror the question, and the mirror responds why Snow White is. And it drives the wicked stepmother queen absolutely crazy. She's got to kill Snow White. She's got to rid herself of this competitor for beauty. And I always feel that Erdogan consults his mirror every morning and he looks in his face, and he sees the face of Gulen looking back at him when he asks the question, who's the most pious of them all? Because Gulen genuinely is and he is not. Be that as it may, my point is this, that once Erdogan had achieved a comfortable degree of power by about 2011, so he had been in the prime ministership for about 6 years at that point, he starts to turn against Gulen and his followers as he gradually, over the next 5 years, starts to undermine the democracy of Turkey. In fact, Erdogan famously said at one point, democracy is like a train. You have to know when to get off. So either he changed or he had just been hiding his true self all along. I don't know. I know that when Gulen supported him, it was because he thought he was dealing with someone who believed in the democracy of Turkey and believed that it could be a Muslim democracy and not a secular state or not an extremist Muslim state, but a Muslim democracy. Gradually, between 2011 and 2016, Erdogan managed to take control of the judiciary, the legislature, the media, and eventually by 2016, even the army. And so what had begun as a democracy evolved to become a dictatorship. 2016 July is the culmination of this, because this is when Erdogan formulated the appearance of a fake coup in a manner reminiscent of how in February 1933 in Berlin, the Nazis under Hitler burnt down the Reichstag and managed to convince, because they had controlled the media at that point, managed to convince all those Germans that it was the communists and the Jews who burnt down the Reichstag, which then gave him the right and responsibility to round up all the communists and to begin a process of a campaign against the Jews that would culminate, of course, in concentration and execution camps years later, and culminate in World War II. That model was followed by Erdogan in July of 2016. So even again, if you Google it online, you'll read the phrase "a failed coup." It was not a failed coup. It was a fake coup. It was not a coup that was instituted by Gulen or his followers that failed because Erdogan magnificently fended it off, but it was a coup that Erdogan himself put in motion, or the appearance of a coup, so he could make that sort of claim and complete his conquest, as it were, of Turkey. Everything about that coup is wrong. Turkey has a long history in the last half of the 20th century of coups almost every 10 years. And there are certain things you just do, like you do it in the middle of the night. You round up the people you need to round up immediately. The fake coup took place at rush hour. No one tries to do a coup at rush hour. No one was rounded up who needed to be rounded up, most importantly, Erdogan himself, and so on. My point is this, that as Gandhi evolved the idea of non-cooperation and non-violence against the British, who were with increasing vehemence trying to crush the Indian nationalist movement, Gulen's non-violence actually assumes a very practical moment in that fake coup of 2016. The violence that Erdogan perpetrated in general and against Turks, and in particular against those affiliated or associated or believed in any way, shape, or form to be associated with Gulen, violence against them, hoping, I suspect, and for a violent pushback, there was none. So Gulen's perspective was entirely that our direction is nonviolent. Our direction is pure patience. The word for that is sabr. And so to pull things together in the next couple of minutes and then open things to questions. In the course of World War II, of course, Gandhi developed the Quit India movement. He continued non-cooperation. And by 1946-47, of course, the British were on the path to removing themselves. And of course, Gandhi was very much opposed to partition. But his counterpart in the Indian Muslim world, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was dead set on having a partition that would separate India into two states that would be respectively Hindu and Muslim. And independence was in any case achieved on the 15th of August of 1947. And interestingly, far from spending his time celebrating, what Gandhi spent his time doing was fasting and spinning, because that became his symbol of living a simple, unadorned life and living for principles. And of course, less than half a year later, on the 30th of January 1948, he was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist, because he was not a Hindu nationalist. He was a Hindu, dyed in the wool, who was at the same time a universalist, in a manner analogous to how Gulen is a Muslim, dyed in the wool, and at the same time a universalist. And of course, Gandhi was assassinated, and Erdogan has attempted repeatedly to extradite Gulen to Turkey, where he would love to execute him. So there are parallels and unparallels. The legacy of Gandhi, satyagraha, truth and satyagraha, thought and nonviolent action. It's not enough to think about this stuff. You've got to act on it. And of course, he was a prolific writer. The legacy of Gulen, who is still very much with us, and 86 years old, and ailing health-wise, is hizmet, service, as altruistic, without a sense of what truth is, but a sense of the obligation to constantly ask what truth is and never to assume you know what it is. Thought that also precipitates action, the action of going out into the world in what is now a hizmet diaspora and providing the services of education and social services and dialogue and discussion services. And he too, of course, is a very prolific writer. So two very different people with two very, very interestingly parallel lives and careers and legacies. And I open the floor to questions and comments, and thank you for your very attention to my long-windedness. Zoya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soltes, for the wonderful and insightful presentation. So we will now open the floor for questions. So participants, please raise your hands if you have a question, and please briefly introduce yourselves by your name and profession. So we'll take the questions in order that hands are raised, and if anyone prefers, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and I will read it on your behalf.
And even if you don't have questions, I'm curious to know who everybody is. So feel free to identify yourself without a question, just to satisfy my curiosity. I could call on people, Zoya.
I have a comment, just wanted to share something. So I am a student of Gandhi and Peace Studies. I did my post-graduation in that. And one thing that, that of course we learned a very balanced view of Gandhi, which with the good parts of him and the bad parts of him, and his conflicts with other leaders as well. So one of the things that stood out was that he had a sense of hierarchy in terms of people as well. So when he was kicked out of the train, he did not have a problem. He had a problem really because they identified the Indians with the blacks. And in the initial days of the South Africa,
yes.
Of course, he grew out of that.
Yes, exactly.
But he grew as a person, and obviously, but that was one thing. And then later on, there's a very good conversation with him and the Arya Samaj leader, Dayanand Saraswati, where he says that where Dayanand Saraswati is saying that there's no casteism in the Vedas, or in whatever your profession, that is your caste. So a son of a person is not the son of, but then Gandhi quotes Gita and says, invokes that part where Krishna is saying that you're a Kshatriya, you're born a Kshatriya. So he says that, the son of a certain profession has to take up that same, profession. And that means there is some kind of a caste. Of course, he did not say that. He said that it doesn't mean that there is good or bad.
But don't you think he also grew out of that, just as he became a kind of advocate for eliminating a kind of social caste system, and particular the concept of Dalits?
That I think he was always there, because even he has this conversation with his wife where he tells her that it's because I do, and she says, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think at some point he gives up and he says, okay, people should do, there is free will, and just because I do it, I should not force things on things. But he was never in terms of like this, he never said they're good or bad, but he did say that you can't grow out of your caste. So there's a lot of, I'm just saying that there is
I completely agree. And actually, it's one of the things that I find important about both Gandhi and Gulen, for whom the equivalent would be his initial focus with Turkish Muslim youth. And now he's this extraordinary advocate of interfaith, etc., and so forth, that I think it's significant in both cases that they grow. They didn't start out as, they weren't born as saints, and they're always saintly. No, by no means. They're human, and they had narrower minds. In fact, Gulen made a comment at one point, because his perspective is from religious piety, and he says, atheists who are doing good works are doing God's work; they just don't know it. So he means by that to encompass everyone. So yeah, I agree with you completely, and I appreciate that comment. Absolutely.
May I say something? This is Amita.
Sure.
Okay. Yes, he probably did at some point, depending on who said what to him and what he said back, say that the caste system was something that was ingrained in Hinduism. But at the same time, remember that when he wanted to go to London, what I have read is that his whole biradari, the whole caste, his father's caste, said, we will expel you from the caste if you go abroad.
That's because what I said, yes.
Yeah, once you leave, you lose your caste, but he went. He didn't care. So he was rebelling against it, right?
But that was also the community with which he lived in London, by paradox. That's where he found his home there initially.
Well, he may have felt comfortable with them, but the point is that in spite of the fact that they said, we're going to expel you, he still went.
He was absolutely a rebel. He was absolutely a rebel. And the same is true of his teachers in London, where he began to disagree. And so, yes, sure, he was a rebel.
I think the very point that he preached non-violence, which was is a rebellious concept in itself.
Even there, he had a famous dialogue in letters with Martin Buber during the Holocaust, and Gandhi had written about how the Jews should practice nonviolence, and Buber wrote, Mahatma, I don't think you understand what's happening in Germany. It isn't India and the Brits. They are already practicing nonviolence, and they're being beaten and they're being killed. And Gandhi came around and he studied and said, you're right, it's a different situation. You can't always just translate a particular action or philosophy from one situation to the next. Then he became a very strong advocate of the right of the Jews to try and get the British out of Palestine. But then he also, at the same time, remained very cognizant of the non-Jewish population of Palestine and its needs, and that they be met, and so on. So very, very interesting developments for him in that as well. Yes, Jai.
Hello. Hello. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir, you are.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. It's night here, so good evening. My name is Jay, and I am currently in my second year of Masters in Conflict Analysis and Peace Building from Jamia. I have a sort of question and a comment combined. I'm not sure what it is. It's just something I gathered from this, and I wanted your opinion also on this the matter. So, first of all, I wanted to ask that since a lot of the session focused on the contrasts and similarities between Gandhi and Gulen, how do they basically view non-violence, and how does non-violence play in their respective uh, id- uh, uh, is it appropriate to say ideology, or is there a better term for it? So first
Sure.
is that.
I think ideology is a great term for it. And of course, much has been written with respect to Gandhi on his philosophy or his ideology of nonviolence. And it's interesting, that the term that is most commonly used is satyagraha. That's not what the words mean, but it's where the words lead. But that, and even in what I just referenced, his correspondence with Martin Buber, his sense was pretty emphatic about nonviolence as the proper path, and that Salt March was an emphatic instance of it actually being enacted, because the participants were not only nonviolent, they weren't even protecting themselves from being beaten. So much has been written on that. In the case of Fethullah Gulen, the first, I would say, concrete opportunity, because I don't think that's even something he thought about one way or another until 2016 and its aftermath. After the fake coup, where there had been violence specifically against Hizmet, and it was being threatened in Turkey, throughout Turkey, beyond Turkey, and so on, he was very emphatic has been very emphatic in his speeches since about never responding to violence with violence, never respond to violence with violence. So much so that actually I would say we are now in 2024. It's not even a topic for the last 7 years. So it was so emphatic for the first, say, year and a half after the fake coup, that after that, it wouldn't even have occurred to anyone affiliated with Hizmet to go in that sort of a direction. So it's just a given. It's just a given. You know, by contrast to Erdogan, who had acted violently not only against Hizmet, the most famous instance being in Gezi Park when there were protests against what was going to be the destruction of a park in order to build buildings and so on. And instead of dialogue, he sent in the troops, and they beat the people who were protesting. That didn't even have anything to do with Hizmet. So there's a strong contrast there. And he no doubt expected a violent pushback from Hizmet, which he didn't get and will never get. So the operative term for Gulen, I would say, is patience, sabr, as opposed to nonviolence per se. The word is sabr.
Yeah. And another thing, basically, in contemporary politics now. So you described Gulen as a very charismatic man. And from your stories, it's very clear how he managed to construct a very, very large movement and gather funds for it and organize it. But one thing I'm curious about is in Turkey, right? The wise course of action. I'm not casting judgment here, right? I'm just curious in this direction where while he was living in Turkey, right? He was I from what I understand, he was exiled to the he was basically forced into exile into US. He went into self-exile. But while he was living in Turkey, why didn't he pursue any solid political power and position where he could establish a concrete base and
right.
Put forward his.
So, no, two very one a good question with two important parts. One, I'm reasonably certain, I wasn't there, that the departure from Turkey was for medical reasons. It evolved to become a self-imposed exile. He was not exiled by the state per se. Frankly, the state would prefer to have someone like him in Turkey so they can put him in prison.
Yeah.
They don't want someone running around in the outside world. But as for political office, that just was simply never an ambition of his. His view of Islam is, or rather his view of his relation to Islam is the shaping of what he refers to as civil Islam, not political Islam. Because his conviction is once religion becomes involved in politics, and of course this is absolutely true across history, and it's not limited to Islam by any means.
Yeah.
Anytime it becomes involved in politics, things become ugly. And if we are talking about what he believes is a beautiful faith, and he wants to strip ugliness from it, then one of the ways to strip ugliness from it is to disconnect it from a political kind of face. And, in the contemporary world, he would say, all you have to do is look at Hamas, look at Hezbollah, look at ISIS, look at the Taliban to see what happens when Islam chooses to become political. And again, his frame of reference is Muslim. It's not limited to Islam. I don't have to tell you what happened not that long ago in India against Muslims.
Yeah.
But I will mention no names because I don't want to put anyone at risk. But he's just never thought of his role as being a political one. And it's ironic because I think Erdogan feels threatened by him as if he wants to become, sweep him aside. He uses the vocabulary as if, it's this the state within the state, and they're trying to take over. That's never been his game.
So that actually brings to mind important point from yesterday's session as well, where we had an in-depth look at Gandhi and his ideology, right? So where an interesting point from that was where in the classical Western sense of separation of church and state, where religion is the ugly thing, it's the evil, and the state is the sort of good and pure thing. That's the contemporary Western understanding, and where instead Gandhi practiced this sort of thing where the politics is evil and the ugly thing, and the religion is the pure and good thing, and that's why we should focus on the separation of the church and state. That is, of course, this sort of thought came later in Gandhi's life, but this was an important point brought up in yesterday's session that we had on Gandhi. Yeah. I just wanted to bring that up because that sounds very similar to what Gulen also himself sort of practiced. I don't think he was cognizant of it, but he practiced it nonetheless. Yeah.
Although it's interesting that Gulen is pushing back against a Turkey that was separating church from state so rigorously that it was trying to crush Islam. And his ideal Turkey would be an Islamic state that is emphatically, completely open in every respect to all forms of faith, not just Islam, but which is, because 99% of the population is Muslim, is in touch with its Muslim roots and not cut off from them. That's not an easy thing for most people to get their minds around.
Yeah.
It takes something. But then again, you think of all of those people, like all those mystics who are able to be simultaneously whatever they are by their particular form of faith, and yet universalists, and see no contradiction. And there's no contradiction in what Gulen's vision would be. So it's not separating church from state, but it's creating a state that is in connection with a church, but all churches are equally free in it.
Right.
Yeah. So yes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
There was a question in the chat. Are you going to read it, Zoya?
Yes.
Okay.
So we have a question by Vikash, and he's asking, how did the contrasting approaches of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance and Gulen's civil Islam influence their respective movements, and what factors contributed to the expansion of their philosophies from a local to a global scale?
I think the answer to the last part of that question, the only answer I can provide is charisma. Because I'm sure we could find many people in many times and places who might advocate nonviolence or advocate Hizmet, and it goes nowhere. So it has something to do with that. It has something to do with, it's the right time, the right place. But I think their respective followers are simply inspired by all that Gandhi as a personality and that Gulen as a personality offer. I am more intimate with Gulen because he's a contemporary, because I've met him, because I've written a lot about him, read a lot about him, and a lot of what he's written. So less so than with Gandhi, but clearly in Gulen's case, for my last book, I interviewed 70 or 80 people who were one way or another associated with him, whether they are, Turkish Muslims, or this Jewish guy from Brooklyn, or this Sikh guy. Forgive me, not Sikh at all. Jain. This Jain guy from Long Island. And again, the same sort of answer. What drew you to him? What draws you to him? What did you find in him? The answer is always his intelligence, his empathy, his compassion, his charisma. And when I first met him, which was after I had written my first book and several articles on him, I had not met him up to that point. In fact, I didn't want to up to that point, because I didn't want to be influenced by whatever would be the effect on me of his personality. I was, in a certain sense, mesmerized, just taken with just what I said, his intelligence, his empathy, his compassion, his lack of concern for himself, but his concern for others. All of these things were so genuine. It reminds me in reverse, I've said this many times before, you meet someone whom you've known and admired from a distance, a sports star or politician or a movie star, whatever, and then you meet them and it's so disappointing because they prove so not to be what you expected. With Gulen, it was the opposite. He was even more than I anticipated. So I can understand why this ever-expanding realm of followers, in being taken with him, is taken with his ideas and embraces the concept of Hizmet. And I have to infer that the same was true for Gandhi. His platform was a different one. I mean, his initial presence within India itself was, political, was the National Congress. But it grew beyond the boundaries of that. And people beyond the boundaries of India became taken with him and what he had to offer. And the life that he seemed to lead that was so consistent with his principles. This guy is not running around in jewels and fancy clothes, as I need not tell you. And he spends his spare time, spinning. And he fasts. He does the things he talks about. And if you put all that together with raw intelligence and a thing I'm calling charisma, on which I cannot put my finger, then it generates an enthusiastic following. Look, we can see how that has happened to an unfortunately in a different direction to a certain extent in India and in the United States. We're fighting for our lives in the next 5 weeks because we have someone running for president who is the exact mirror opposite of Gandhi and Gulen in what he teaches, but has captured the imagination through some absurd, inexplicable, charismatic effect on literally millions of Americans who will no doubt cast their ballots for him. So it's a sort of non-answer answer, because I can give you these things, and in the end, it's like, I don't know. It's just something.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soltes, for your response. I just wanted to ask Vikash if you would like to just step in and say a few words, or maybe just to say hi to Dr. Soltes.
Yeah. Hello.
There was also another question in the chat about faith, I think.
Yes.
Or is that Vikash's question? Oh,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's those are the questions.
Okay, we'll get to it.
I got the things I wanted to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You can just introduce yourself to Dr. Soltes. We would love to know who you are, and everyone else can just also just introduce themselves before asking the question.
I'm a fellowship called Gandhi Fellowship, and currently I'm in northern part of India in Gurgaon.
Great. Wonderful.
Next, we have a question by Adil Eman. Adil, would you like to just come and ask your question directly and also introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Oris. Hope you are doing well and good. Actually, we have been met in Chennai 4 months back.
Yes. Fantastic.
Yeah. I think you remember me.
I do.
Yeah,
I remember,
I have your
book,
book,
and I very fondly.
Book.
Yes. Excellent.
Yeah. My question is actually, just the question is there. I have read on. You spoke about the Fethullah Gulen and Gandhi. Gandhi is like totally focused on like non-violence, that is ahimsa. And Fethullah Gulen is totally focused on educational base. And they both like Gandhi is a little bit political view. His view on political as well. At the same time, Fethullah Gulen don't involve in political things. So both the concept is service to humanity. Both the leader was like service to humanity concept. That is Gandhi Sarvodaya is similar to Gulenism. My question is, just a minute, I have written down the question. How can be the principle of faith-based humanism from Gandhi and Gulen be applied to address current global challenge, such as extremism, poverty, and inter-religious conflicts? Because Fethullah Gulen is a little bit political. He don't involve in political, but Gandhi is a little bit involved in political things.
Well, let me start with your phrase, faith-based humanism, because I mean, there's so many different angles from which to approach this, and all of them are based on the assumption that humans are thinking beings and that we are most human when we are thinking. And too many of us, too much of the time, don't think. We are more comfortable being told what to think. And we can see that historically, and we can see that in the contemporary world. We can see that going all the way back to Socrates and Plato, and the kind of questions that Socrates is represented as asking of individuals who claim to be wise knowers of things. He asks Euthyphro what holiness or what piety is. He asks Gorgias what justice is. And all these guys assume that they know. And when Socrates starts to question them, it turns out that they not only don't know, they really haven't thought about it that much. They just take it for granted that they know. And if we jump 25 centuries back to our own time, I mean, we see that sort of an issue still pertains. So how can religion can be such an effective instrument at unifying people, and at the same time it has been and can be such an effective instrument at separating people. So the question then becomes, how can I use faith so that it is humanistic, so that it encompasses all humans and not only those of my own particular faith? And I guess the answer is teaching. The answer is continuing to articulate the ways in which my faith works so perfectly well for me. And if I acknowledge that your faith, which is different from mine, works equally well for you, yours won't work for me, but mine won't work for you, that doesn't diminish my sense of my own faith as perfect for me. If I can embrace that idea, then I can embrace the idea, and your faith can work perfectly for you. Then we have the basis, first of all, for genuine interfaith conversation, because I'm not trying to convince you, consciously or unconsciously, to come over to my side. Neither are you trying to convince me to come over to your side. We are just genuinely interested in the different ways in which we approach the same basic issue, divinity. And the likelihood is we're going to find out that we have a lot more in common than we realized we did, even though there are differences, but the differences don't undercut our commonality as humans and all our needs and all our desires. It's that kind of a conversation, but of course the issue is, how do you have that conversation? So here we are in a group of 20 some odd people. It's relatively easy because we're a relatively small group that was pre-organized. But how can I translate that onto a larger scale, which is what in different ways Gulen and Gandhi did or have done. But alas, you have people like Donald Trump, who has the same sort of a platform, but uses it in exactly the opposite direction, to drive wedges between groups of people, whether it's for religion or for race or for nationality or for ethnicity. And I don't know, how one works one's way around that, except to do what both Gulen and Gandhi were doing, which is, I just keep at it. I just keep trying. And even if I convince one person to think in a more humanistic manner, even if I can convince, as I mentioned sort of jokingly earlier, someone who doesn't even believe in God, and I don't believe in God because of all the violence done in the name of God, if I can convince that person, that's not God, that's people who do things in the name of God. And you know what? You don't have to believe in God. You just have to want to improve the condition of humans and improve the world in which humans live and improve how we work with each other, that it doesn't matter what the particulars of my form of faith is. But you just have to keep trying, I guess, and keep building on what you're doing, what I'm trying to do, what Gandhi was doing, what Gulen was doing, and not get discouraged and not give up. So that's my long-winded non-answer answer, Ideal. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your explanation. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Thank you so much, Adil, for your question, and Dr. Soltes for your response. So now we have Yasin's question. Yasin, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Ori sir. I am Yasin from Kolkata. I am businessman with special interest in interfaith dialogues. So, as we know, Gandhi promoted religious pluralism and unity in India among different faiths. And similarly, Gulen also promotes interfaith dialogues. So my question is, how do they view their views on interfaith dialogue address the coexistence of different religious communities?
I think that their views are very close to what I was just trying to say in response to Adil's question, which is the challenge is to embrace the idea that my particular form of faith can be perfectly perfect for me, and yet recognize that it may not be perfect for you, and that and you come to the same recognition. One of the things that I find extraordinary about what we call Hinduism is that it has that ideology built into it. So if I'm a Krishnite and you're a Vaishnavite, for me, Krishna is the consummate manifestation of Brahma, and the Gita is therefore the consummate text to guide me. You as a Vaishnavite think of Krishna as just one of the avatars of Vishnu. And so we don't have the same view, do we, of how God is ideally manifest in our reality. And yet it wouldn't occur to me to attack you for your view, and it wouldn't occur to you to attack me for my view, historically speaking, because ultimately we both understand that they're both manifestation of this thing called Brahman anyway, as is Shiva, as is Kali, as is Devi, and so on and so on and so forth. So it has kind of built into it, ideally. It doesn't always work out because people are people and violence sometimes happens anyway. But for the most part, it's worked out that way. Whereas, interestingly, by comparison, what we call the Abrahamic traditions tend to be more monolithic in their understanding of God. There is only one God. And, even Christianity has a triune concept of God. So Christians should have no problems understanding what Hinduism is about, because they believe in a God that is singular and yet has three aspects. For Jews and Muslims, traditionally, they're thinking, what's with these Christians? They're polytheists. There can't be three in one. There's one God, that's it, end of story. And no human form, no physical form whatsoever. So you guys are idol worshipers. So the concept that some, not all, Christians will depict Jesus or depict God the Father is for Muslims and Jews kind of crazy. But of course, for all of them, they go to India and they're thinking, my God, they're all idol worshipers, because they don't understand the concept of darshan. They don't understand what is involved when I go to the mandir. And they assume I'm worshiping that piece of stone. That's not what's going on. So I think it's about exploring and explaining the different ways in which ultimately we're all trying to get, however, to the same sort of the fulfillment of the same needs, the same issues, the same problems. What do we want for ourselves? What do we want for our children, our grandchildren? What do we want for the world? And how can we make that happen? And we can do it by reference to divinity, or we can do it without reference to divinity, but taking the reference to divinity to mean, and it's my understanding of divinity, end of story, period, otherwise I'll kill you. That's what we've got to kind of dig out of our sensibilities. And that, to repeat what I said to Adil, is just something we have to keep working at. Those of us who are aware of this and working at it have to keep working at it. And that's what Gandhi was working at. And that's what Gulen is still working at, and his followers. Another non-answer answer. And long-winded at that, Yasin.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So I see that Jalil has posted a kind of a reflection, and also I think he wants some clarification. So maybe Jalil, you can introduce yourself and also share your insights with Dr. Soltis, and you can also check if this information was shared in the session.
Thank you. So very nice session. I'm very unstable. My network is very unstable. That's why I just typed my question. It's basically my question. There is no reflection on something. My question was.
So I can see your question. Let me just scroll to the end of it.
Maybe I can read it for you, Doctor, if you want.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Please.
Gandhi addressed the harmony within the Hindu religion, and he interpreted the scripture and religion according to his view, as his view of Varna. My question is how Gulen addressed the sex and caste system of Islam or Muslims, how he approached both caste and sex, and is he developed something based on text and etc.
Yeah. So I guess my answer has three. It's sort of a three-part question, so I have a three-part answer. Part one, he is bound and determined, Gulen is, to undercut the sectarianism that exists in Islam, beginning almost from the time of the death of the Prophet in 632, where one has the Sunni and the Shi'i directions. And then it's interesting, many Muslims will look at Sufis as an altogether different sect, although I think that's rather inaccurate. And in any case, beyond that point, as I said earlier, you have the different schools, the different madhabs of Sharia. So if I call myself a Muslim, that's insufficient. I am a Wahhabi, Hanbali, Sunni Muslim, or whatever it is that I call myself. His goal for Islam would be not to eliminate diversity of perspective, but to eliminate the negativity that results from that diversity of perspective, and to see it as ultimately referring to an all-encompassing reality, which is God and ourselves, and acknowledging that what we have from God is, and this is the second part of my answer to your question, and that has to do with texts. So text-based, he will point out how in the Quran or in the Hadith, the parts that are most significant refer to the importance of diversity. There is a phrase, an ayat, a verse that reads, I created you in different sects so that you might come to know one another. And he uses that frequently, Gulen does, not only to reference internal Islam, but Islam's relationship, because the context within the Quran can be understood to construe the relationship to the Muslims with the Jews, the Sumerians, the Mandaeans, and the Christians. Those are the particular other groups that are being referenced in that context. So he does use texts, but the thing about text is texts are designed to be interpreted. And he would simply suggest that the Taliban is misinterpreting the Muslim text. Where in Islam does it say women should not get an education? Where does it say that women should be completely covered up as a principle of modesty? Where does it say that women should not learn to write? Nowhere, he would say. So that is not just interpreting, that's interpreting beyond the interpretation in accordance with your own needs. So he would argue across Islam, but this would apply across humanity, that much of what is presented or mispresented as Islam is a function of the human ego, and more often than not, the male human ego and its need for power. And so it takes texts and misconstrues them. And the third has to do with caste. Islam has a relatively good history of non-caste, at least, for example, and that's one of the beauties of the Hajj. People who go on pilgrimage, right, to Mecca, you reach a point well outside Mecca, and whatever you wore on the journey, you remove, and everybody puts on the same kind of, I call it the plain brown wrapper, right? Everyone puts on a white robe of the same sort. So you cannot distinguish anyone in terms of their socioeconomic status, where they come from in society, because everyone, as it were, is by design equal now as they approach the Kaaba and seek whatever one gets, of course, spiritually from pilgrimage. So he would emphasize that feature of Islam and suggest that where caste plays in, it's a misplay. It doesn't belong. If that answers your question, Jalil.
Yeah, it was nice. But the third part, I can address something. I mean, if we look
Please.
on the pilgrimage rage or some kind, but in grassroots level, there is a kind of caste system, na?
Absolutely, there is, because again, people are people. So that's not embedded in Islam, but it can be embedded in the Muslim world, because the Muslim world, of course, also, by the way, it conforms in certain respects to the culture in which it is embedded. So Arab Muslims, Turkish Muslims, Persian Muslims, Indian Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, Filipino Muslims, American Muslims. Let me give you an example, a concrete example. In December of 2016, I went to a Hizmet conference for a couple of days, not far out on the coast of Maryland. And I was asked to speak to a group of kids. They were like 18 to 30. There were maybe 15 of them. And of those 15, I would say maybe 6 or 7 were guys, and 7, 8, 9 were women. And they asked me if I had criticisms of Hizmet. And I said, well, I do have one. It seems to me that most of the time when I go to a home, the men are sitting in the living room and we're having the conversation, the sohbet, and the women are in the kitchen preparing the meal. From where I sit, I'm wondering when the women are going to be able to join the conversation and the men are going to be in the kitchen helping with the cooking. And there was an immediate, I loved it, pushback from some of the young girls who said, that's changing. And of course, they're also American born. They said, in America, we won't let that happen. And I understood, but I raised the question anyway, that was in part Turkish culture. In Turkish culture, if they were all Jews, if they were all Hindus, if they were all Muslims, it'd be the same. The women would be in the kitchen preparing the food, and the women would be in the living room having the conversation. So that wasn't Hizmet, it was Hizmet in its Turkish roots. And as it has spread over the world, presumably it will change in different ways from culture to culture, from country to country. And so I would say that of Islam in general, which, is still, that doesn't, so I'm not questioning your comment. I think you're absolutely correct. But I'm trying to put it in that sort of a context, a people context rather than a God context, if I can put it that way.
Then my question is Gulen mention or address this kind of problems? As Gandhi mentions, Gandhi mostly addressed the problem of caste system, Varna system. Na? Then like Gandhi, is he addressed this kind of social caste system? That was my question.
No, Gandhi emphatically did. By implication, Gulen has, not directly. By implication, but what I mean by that is when he has written or talked about, eliminating divisions among different groups, and he brings up socioeconomic as well as spiritual or cultural. So by implication, he's referring to just that. But I don't think I've ever encountered in anything he's written the use of the word caste. And of course, I'm reading him in English because my Turkish is not good enough. I can refer to stuff in Turkish, but it's not good enough to really read him. So, I may be wrong about that. One of my early on in my familiarity with what was still being called Gulen movement, I raised my hand in a conference and said, the word tolerance that's being used is not a good word. Tolerance means I'm up here and you're down there, and I allow you, da-da-da-da. And one of my Turkish colleagues raised his hand and said, well, that's a poor translation. The Turkish word is hoşgörü. And hoşgörü, I translate because the root of the word is eye. Hoşgörü is seeing the world from the eyes of your neighbor. So the word that they have started to use and that I use in English is embrace, because that's very different. This is embrace. This is tolerate or tolerance. So it may be that whatever the Turkish word for caste would be is actually used by him, but if so, I'm not aware of it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Jalil, for your question. And thank you so much, Dr. Soltes, for your response. So we'll just take a last question by Azim. So Azim, you can just quickly ask your question because we are already running out of time. So please go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for this very insightful session. My question is a little bit different, sir, from the context. I wish to ask about the term political Islam that has gained considerable attention, especially after the perceived failure of the Muslim Brotherhood's effort to establish Sharia-based rule. We have Rashid Ghanouchi in Tunisia talking about the same, and also sometimes Erdogan talking about the same. So I would like to ask, do you observe any elements of political Islam in the teachings of Gulen?
I would say all but not. Another of his models, I mentioned him in passing, is Said Nursi. And Said Nursi had a lot of thoughts that are similar in terms of the compatibility of Islam as a religion with modern science, that they're not enemies, but on the contrary, can work together, and this, that, and the other thing. When Ataturk was trying to shape the new state, he wanted Said Nursi to somehow join his government. And Nursi refused because he did not want to be involved in politics. And the consequence of that was that he was kind of in flight from the government, which then, because he wouldn't join them, they were worried about what he represented as a kind of alternative, a situation which, of course, has manifested itself ultimately in the relationship between Erdogan and Gulen, that Erdogan is in hot pursuit of Gulen because he feels threatened by him. But I have not encountered in Gulen's writing anywhere the only reference to politics. Let me correct myself. The only reference to politics is where he comments on the inaccurate, incorrect politicization of Islam. So he looks at an organization like the Taliban, or he repeatedly has written about ISIS, or Hamas, for that matter, which is a faith-based organization which is very much wrapped around politics. And of that, he is consistently critical. So there, yes, he brings up politics. But in terms of his own ambitions, never. And to the extent that he offers a kind of, well, how should Islam be as a political entity? His answer has consistently been, it should embed itself within a democratic style government, where by definition, in being part of a democratic style government, it's going to be on an equal footing with other forms of faith, all of which take half a step back from governance because it falls to the government to do governance. So there too, you might say he brings up the issue of politics as something that is a necessary part of human life, and that for Islam means working together with a democratic kind of state. If that answers your question, Dr.
Thank
Azim.
you, sir.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Azim, for your question. So now we come towards the end of our session. Thank you once again, Dr. Soltes, for such an enlightening session. And I'm sure like all the participants have gained a lot from your talk. I would also like to remind the participants that the reflection forms for this session will be sent to you via email. So please keep an eye on your inbox. Also, if anyone is interested in watching previous sessions,
Yeah, so essentially, Dr. Soltes has spoken for In Dialogue Foundation before, and the videos are there on YouTube. And plus, also, he was in India earlier this year, and he took we had a roundtable conference with him, and the report of that is available on our website, indialogue.in. So make sure you go and check it out. So that's all for. Thank you again, Professor
And that
Soltes.
session had a lot about gender, by the way, with which
Yes.
this session did not.
Yes.
So if you're interested in that, that would be a particularly interesting one to listen to. It was very dynamic. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Soltes. It is always a pleasure listening to you, and I think anybody who's heard you a number of times can't have enough. So we look forward to having you soon again, and your lovely insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You.
Appreciate it. Bye, everyone.